Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express is one of the most celebrated detective novels of all time, showcasing the brilliance of her famous Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot. First published in 1934, the novel is a masterpiece of mystery fiction, renowned for its intricate plot, clever misdirection, and unforgettable conclusion. The story takes place aboard the luxurious Orient Express, a train traveling through Europe, where a wealthy American passenger is found murdered in his compartment. With the train stranded in a snowdrift and an international cast of suspects trapped together, Poirot must untangle a web of deception, hidden identities, and personal vendettas to uncover the truth. Christie was inspired to write this novel by real-life events, including the infamous kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's son in 1932, which shocked the world and left an indelible mark on crime history. The structure of Murder on the Orient Express follows the classic whodunit format, but Christie subverts expectations by delivering an ending that is both shocking and unprecedented. The book's setting, a confined space filled with potential killers, adds to the tension and sense of urgency, making it one of the most compelling mysteries ever written. Over the years, Murder on the Orient Express has been adapted into numerous films, television shows, and stage productions, cementing its status as a timeless work of detective fiction. With its intricate character studies, moral dilemmas, and masterful storytelling, the novel continues to captivate readers and remains a cornerstone of the mystery genre. Now, let's delve into the story, beginning with the journey that sets everything into motion. The journey begins on a bitterly cold winter's day at the railway station in Aleppo, Syria, where Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective with a mind as sharp as his meticulously groomed mustache, prepares to board the Taurus Express. Fresh off solving a case in the Middle East, Poirot is looking forward to some well-earned rest, but fate has other plans. His journey will take him to Istanbul before he transfers onto the luxurious Orient Express, bound for Europe. At the station, Poirot encounters an old friend, M. Bouc, a director of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons Lits, the company that operates the Orient Express. Bouc, an affable and slightly pompous man, is delighted to see Poirot and insists that he join him on the train to London. Though Poirot had not originally planned to travel immediately, he decides to accept the invitation. However, when he arrives at the Tocatlian Hotel in Istanbul, he receives an urgent telegram calling him back to London for a case. With no time to waste, he secures a last-minute ticket on the Orient Express, a journey that will soon plunge him into one of the most perplexing murder cases of his career. As Poirot boards the train, he notices an unusually full passenger list, an oddity for this time of year. The first-class compartment is entirely booked, which is unusual for winter travel. Poirot is initially without a berth, but M. Bouc manages to secure him a small second-class compartment. The detective observes his fellow passengers, a diverse group of travelers from different walks of life, seemingly unrelated yet bound together by coincidence. or something more sinister. Among them is an unpleasant and flamboyant American businessman named Samuel Ratchet. Ratchet, a man of wealth but little refinement, exudes an air of menace. His sharp eyes and predatory demeanor give Poirot an immediate sense of unease. Ratchet attempts to hire Poirot, claiming that his life is in danger. He insists that someone is following him, trying to kill him, and he needs Poirot's protection. However, Poirot, who prides himself on his instincts, refuses the offer without hesitation. He tells Ratchet plainly, "I do not like your face." There is something deeply unsettling about the man, something beyond the mere threats against him. As the train departs Istanbul, Poirot takes in his surroundings. The passengers include a Russian princess, a shy Swedish missionary, a jovial Italian, an English governess, a reserved and proper British colonel, an elderly American woman, and several other figures, each with their own secrets. The train glides smoothly along the tracks, its opulence unmatched, gilded wood panels, plush velvet seats, and an air of grandeur that transports its passengers to another world. But beneath this elegance, an undercurrent of tension simmers. The second night aboard the Orient Express is when the tranquility shatters. The train is passing through the snowy Yugoslavian countryside when Poirot, resting in his compartment, hears odd noises in the corridor. A muffled cry, perhaps a groan, catches his attention. Then, a voice calls out from another compartment, inquiring in French, "What is it? What has happened?" Silence follows. Poirot listens intently, but hears nothing further, so he dismisses the disturbance and drifts back into slumber. Later that night, Poirot wakes again, this time to the sound of a loud thud against the wall separating his compartment from that of Ratchet's. The detective remains still, listening. Footsteps move down the corridor. A bell rings, summoning the conductor. Poirot steps outside and sees a woman in a red kimono walking away, but he cannot identify her in the dim light. The train continues its journey through the night, oblivious to the crime that has just taken place. By morning, the Orient Express is at a standstill. A heavy snowstorm has halted the train in its tracks, somewhere in Yugoslavia. As passengers wake and gather in the dining car, uneasy murmurs ripple through the air. It is then that M. Bouck bursts into the car, looking pale and shaken. Ratchet has been found dead in his compartment, brutally stabbed multiple times. The door is locked from the inside, and there are no clear signs of forced entry. The American millionaire, who had feared for his life, has met his end in a most gruesome manner. Poirot is summoned at once. He examines the crime scene with methodical precision. Ratchet's body is riddled with stab wounds, some deep and forceful, others shallow and hesitant. The crime is messy, almost as if committed by two different people. A handkerchief with an embroidered H lies near the victim, along with a pipe cleaner. A watch, broken and stopped at 1:15 a.m., provides an estimated time of death. There are strange clues, contradictions, and inconsistencies that make little sense. The train is stranded in the snow, meaning the killer is still on board. There is no escape, no outside force that could have intervened. Poirot knows one thing for certain: this is no ordinary murder. With a train full of potential suspects, each with their own secrets, motives, and alibis, the famed detective prepares for what will become one of the most perplexing cases of his career. The game is afoot, and Poirot must use every ounce of his brilliance to uncover the truth before the killer strikes again. Hercule Poirot sits quietly in the dining car, sipping his morning coffee. The hum of conversation around him is filled with unease. News of Samuel Ratchet's murder has spread, and the passengers are exchanging whispers, their eyes darting about the room, searching for answers or for a killer among them. Poirot, ever methodical, knows that time is of the essence. The train remains stuck in the snowdrift, meaning the murderer is still aboard, trapped with the rest of them. There is no escape, no external force that could have committed the crime. The culprit must be among the passengers or crew. But who and why? Bouc, anxious and unsettled, implores Poirot to take charge of the investigation. Mon cher, you must solve this case before panic sets in, Bouc says, his mustache twitching nervously. We are in an isolated train, and there is no police to assist us. You are our only hope. Poirot accepts the task. He begins with an examination of Ratchet's compartment, the very place where a life was so violently ended. Dr. Constantine, a medical expert traveling aboard the train, assists Poirot in analyzing the body. The scene is a perplexing contradiction of evidence. Ratchet has been stabbed 12 times, yet the wounds vary in depth and strength. Some are forceful and precise, while others are shallow and appear hesitant. It is almost as if two different people, one strong, the other weak, committed the crime. But that, Poirot muses, would be far too simple an explanation. A further search of the compartment reveals additional clues. A burned scrap of paper lies in the ashtray. Carefully reconstructing the singed edges, Poirot makes out part of a message. Remember little Daisy Armstrong. The name jolts Poirot's memory. The Armstrong case, one of the most tragic crimes of recent times. Years earlier, an American child named Daisy Armstrong was kidnapped from her wealthy family's home. The desperate parents paid an enormous ransom, but the child was murdered nonetheless. The crime sent shockwaves through high society, leaving the Armstrong family shattered. Daisy's mother, unable to bear the grief, died in childbirth. Her father, consumed with despair, took his own life. The mastermind behind the kidnapping was none other than a man named Cassetti, who evaded justice and disappeared into the underworld. Could it be that Ratchet was Cassetti, hiding under a false identity? Poirot turns to Bouc, who pales at the realization. Then this is not a crime of opportunity, Bouc murmurs. This is vengeance. Poirot nods. If Ratchet was indeed Cassetti, then someone aboard this train had a very strong reason to kill him. This was no random murder. It was a crime born of hatred, grief, and the pursuit of justice outside the law. The detective continues his search of Ratchet's cabin. A handkerchief with the initial H is found near the victim, along with a pipe cleaner, perhaps belonging to a smoker. The broken watch, frozen at 1:15 a.m., provides a likely time of death. Yet Poirot knows appearances can be deceiving. It is all too neatly staged. His next step is to interview the passengers, one by one. He begins with Hector McQueen, Ratchet's young American secretary. McQueen appears visibly shaken by the murder. When questioned, he confirms that his employer had feared for his life, receiving threatening letters before boarding the train. Did you know who he really was? Poirot asks. McQueen hesitates, then nods. Yes, he admits. I figured it out a while ago. Ratchet was Cassetti, the man responsible for the Armstrong case. My father was the district attorney involved in the case, and I recognized Ratchet's face from old reports. Poirot takes note of this information, but finds Mac Queen's reaction genuine. The young man is horrified by the murder, but does not seem guilty himself. However, Poirot knows better than to take anyone's word at face value. He proceeds to interview the valet, Edward Masterman, an Englishman who had served Ratchet diligently. Masterman, a man of rigid composure, states that he had no personal feelings toward his employer. "I did my job, sir, nothing more." He claims to have prepared Ratchet's sleeping arrangements the night before, and then retired early due to a headache, taking aspirin given to him by a fellow passenger. Next is Greta Olsen, the Swedish missionary. She had briefly entered Ratchet's compartment the night before to bring him a sleeping draught. She recalls hearing a noise in the night, but thought nothing of it. She appears nervous and fragile, but gives no obvious indication of guilt. Then there is Mrs. Hubbard, the garrulous and excitable American woman, who is adamant that a man was in her compartment the night of the murder. She had bolted her door, but insists she heard someone moving in the adjoining compartment, which connected to Ratchet's room. "I tell you, there was a man in there," she cries, dramatically waving her hands. "I was too afraid to open my eyes, but I just know it." Poirot listens carefully, considering her claim. Could the murderer have escaped through her compartment? Or was Mrs. Hubbard's account exaggerated? As he works through the interviews, Poirot observes patterns forming. Some of the passengers seem unnerved, while others remain strangely calm. Yet, one thing is clear: these people are not random strangers. There is a thread tying them together. By the time Poirot has spoken with several more passengers, including the reserved Colonel Arbuthnot and the charming Countess Androny, he is convinced that this is no ordinary crime. The number of conflicting alibis and odd details is too convenient. The broken watch, the different depths of stab wounds, the mysterious woman in the red kimono seen in the corridor, it all suggests a conspiracy rather than a single killer. Poirot returns to M'Bauk and Dr. Constantine, his mind whirring. "My friends," he says, "this is not merely a murder case. This is a trial one that has taken place outside the law." The train remains still, locked in ice and snow, but inside, the investigation is heating up. Poirot knows the answer lies within the intricate puzzle of lies and half-truths, and he intends to solve it before the Orient Express moves again. Hercule Poirot, ever methodical, resumes his investigation. The pieces of the puzzle are beginning to take shape, but contradictions linger, clouding the true picture of the murder. He knows that the only way forward is through precision, through carefully peeling away the layers of deception to reveal the truth beneath. Sitting in the dining car, Poirot reviews his notes with meticulous care. The evidence before him is striking, yet disjointed: 12 stab wounds, some deep, others barely piercing the skin. A broken watch, stopped at 1:15 a.m. A lady's handkerchief, embroidered with the initial H. A pipe cleaner, possibly belonging to a gentleman. The burnt scrap of paper, partially revealing the Armstrong name. A woman seen wearing a red kimono. Mrs. Hubbard's insistence that a man had been inside her compartment during the night. Each clue seems significant, yet none fully explain the murder in isolation. Poirot senses a pattern, a thread running through each account, but he must still uncover how it all fits together. His first order of business is to continue questioning the passengers, searching for inconsistencies, hidden connections, and most importantly, the truth behind their alibis. He summons Princess Dragomirov, the elderly and imperious Russian noblewoman, to the dining car. She enters regally, taking her seat with the composed air of one accustomed to authority. Her face, lined with age, betrays little emotion as she waits for Poirot to speak. "Madam," Poirot begins in a calm but firm tone, "you are familiar with the Armstrong family, are you not?" The princess, with a regal nod, replies, "Yes. I was a dear friend of Linda Arden, the mother of Mrs. Armstrong. A remarkable woman, a great actress. We were close, and I have followed her family's misfortunes with a heavy heart." Poirot leans forward, watching her closely. "The tragedy of little Daisy Armstrong was a great crime," the princess interrupts, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "A child stolen, a mother's heart broken, a father driven to despair. All because of that man, Cassetti. There was no justice for them." Poirot studies her carefully. "Did you know that the man who called himself Samuel Ratchet was, in fact, Cassetti?" Her lined face remains unmoved, but there is a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps satisfaction. "I know now," she says coolly. "And had I known before, I would have taken my own revenge upon him. But I am old, Monsieur Poirot. I have neither the strength nor the will for such violence." Her alibi is seemingly solid. She retired early, attended by her devoted maid, Hildegard Schmidt, who confirms that her mistress did not leave her compartment that night. Poirot nods and makes a mental note. He does not yet dismiss her as a suspect, but she does not seem the type to have committed such an erratic crime. Next, Poirot calls Colonel Arbuthnot to be questioned. The British officer, his posture straight and his demeanor stiff, sits before Poirot with the air of a man unaccustomed to scrutiny. He does not flinch under Poirot's sharp gaze. "I was awake for some time last night, speaking with Mr. McQueen," he states plainly. "We had a long discussion about India. I went to bed around 2 o'clock. Poirot nods, but is not yet satisfied. "Colonel, you are a trained man, experienced in discipline and precision. Would you say that the wounds inflicted upon Mr. Ratchet were delivered in a methodical manner?" Arbuthnot's jaw tightens slightly. "No," he admits. "Some were deep and deadly, others barely scratches. That is not the work of a professional. It was frenzied, uncoordinated." Poirot notes the words carefully. The colonel's demeanor suggests honesty, but he is still a soldier, a man who could have exacted revenge for the Armstrong family with great precision. But if Arbuthnot were the sole killer, why would some wounds be so weak? Poirot moves on. Next, he questions Count and Countess Androny, a strikingly beautiful and noble couple. The Count, a dignified Hungarian aristocrat, is protective of his wife. From the beginning, he makes it clear that he will not tolerate intrusive questioning. "My wife was unwell last night," the Count says firmly. "She took a sleeping draught and did not leave our compartment. We have no knowledge of this crime." Poirot, however, is more interested in the Countess. The lovely but nervous woman avoids his gaze. "Madam, may I see your passport?" he asks politely. The Count, before his wife can respond, interjects. "That is unnecessary, Monsieur Poirot. I have already told you we were in our compartment all night." Poirot does not press further for the moment, but he senses something hidden, especially in the Countess's hesitation. Next, Hildegard Schmidt, the devoted maid to Princess Dragomirov, is called in. She is a stout, nervous woman with the air of someone who prefers to remain unnoticed. "I heard nothing unusual last night," she says timidly. "I retired after attending to the princess." But she hesitates, her face suddenly thoughtful. "Yes, Madame Schmidt," Poirot encourages. "I did see someone," she says slowly. "A conductor walking down the hallway, but he was not quite right. Something was off." "Can you describe him?" Poirot asks eagerly. She shakes her head, flustered. "I do not remember well. He wore a uniform, but his face, I did not see it clearly." Poirot leans back, thoughtful. A disguised figure. Another deliberate misdirection. By this point, Poirot's suspicion is deepening. One undeniable truth begins to emerge. Nearly everyone on this train has a connection to the Armstrong family. The odds of this being a coincidence are impossibly slim. Could this be more than a murder? Could it be justice? Poirot decides it is time to test his theory. He gathers all the passengers together in the dining car and takes his place at the head of the room. The tension in the air is palpable. Snow continues to trap the train, the landscape outside eerily still. Inside, the passengers sit stiffly, waiting for Poirot's next words. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot announces, his voice calm but commanding, "I believe we are dealing with an extraordinary case, a case of collective justice." A heavy silence falls over the room. Expressions change, some startled, some unreadable, some shifting with the weight of unspoken truths. Poirot's gaze moves across the assembled faces. "We have been looking for a murderer," he continues, "but perhaps what we are dealing with is not a single killer, but an execution." The room remains silent, yet Poirot can feel the tension thickening. He knows now that he is on the right path. The murder of Samuel Ratchet, formerly Cassetti, was not a crime committed in secrecy by a lone figure in the night. It was something greater, something premeditated. And now, he must uncover how deep this conspiracy goes. Hercule Poirot sat in quiet contemplation, his fingers gently tapping on the armrest of his seat as he sorted through the facts. The atmosphere inside the stranded train had shifted. A weight hung over the passengers, not just from the murder, but from the realization that nearly everyone on board seemed to be tied to the Armstrong family tragedy in one way or another. That could not be a coincidence. Poirot had suspected from the beginning that Ratchet's death was not the work of a lone, opportunistic killer. Now, the evidence pointed to something far more elaborate. The crime seemed too personal, too filled with intent, to be anything but carefully planned. The question that remained was how all the pieces fit together. His little notebook was filling up with observations, but one detail stood out above the rest: the red kimono. It had been seen in the corridor on the night of the murder, yet searches of the compartments had yielded nothing. That, too, could not be a coincidence. Someone was deliberately planting misleading clues, obscuring the truth. Poirot knew that the killer, or killers, must have calculated every detail carefully, ensuring that each piece of evidence contradicted another. But who was responsible for placing the red kimono? More importantly, why? He decided to call for another round of questioning, this time focusing on details that had not been fully explored. He had already established that many of the passengers were emotionally entangled in the Armstrong case, but he needed more than just motive. He needed method. Who had the opportunity? Who had the knowledge to execute such a precise murder? There were still gaps in the timeline of that night, and Poirot intended to fill them. He began by summoning Cyrus Hardman, the brash American who had claimed to be a private detective. Hardman's earlier statement suggested that he had been hired by Ratchet to keep an eye out for a potential attacker, but Poirot found the man's account suspicious. If Hardman had been truly watching over Ratchet, how had the murder occurred so easily? Why had no one been seen entering or exiting his compartment? The detective studied Hardman as he took his seat, noting the man's rigid posture, the tension in his jaw. Hardman reaffirmed his original story. He had been looking out for a suspicious man with a dark complexion and a high voice. Poirot listened carefully, but sensed something was off. He pressed Hardman for more details, asking how exactly he had kept watch, where he had been positioned, and whether he had heard anything unusual. That was when the cracks in Hardman's story began to show. He hesitated, avoiding eye contact before finally sighing, as though accepting that he could no longer maintain the illusion. With a lowered voice, he admitted that he had not been hired by Ratchet at all. The truth was that he had personal ties to the Armstrong case. He had once been in love with a woman who had suffered deeply after the Armstrong tragedy, the sister of Daisy Armstrong's mother. That loss had devastated her, and she had eventually passed away from grief. Hardman had spent years looking for Cassetti, determined to see justice served, when he discovered that Ratchet was, in fact, the very man responsible for the Armstrong family's suffering. He had felt a sense of grim satisfaction that someone had finally exacted revenge. Though he had not personally participated in the crime, he had known, deep down, that this was no random act. Poirot listened carefully, noting the bitterness in Hardman's voice, the lingering anger that suggested he had spent years searching for closure. That same bitterness was something he had observed in others aboard the train Mary Debenham, Princess Dragomirov, Colonel Arbuthnot. They all carried wounds from the past, wounds that had not yet healed. And the more he thought about it, the more the evidence seemed to suggest that this was not the work of one person alone. But if there had been multiple hands involved, how had they coordinated such a flawless execution? Poirot turned his attention next to Mrs. Hubbard, the talkative American woman who had been adamant that she had seen a man in her compartment during the night. Her account had been dramatic, filled with exaggerated horror, but Poirot now had to question whether her panic had been genuine or if it had been part of the deception. When he brought up the possibility that her claims might have been staged, she stiffened, her usual warmth replaced with a rare seriousness. She insisted that she had truly been terrified, that she had no involvement in the crime. But Poirot could tell she was hiding something. As the questioning continued, it became increasingly evident that each passenger had a role to play, whether large or small, in shaping the narrative of that night. Some may not have physically carried out the murder, but they had contributed in other ways, by placing misleading clues, by providing false alibis, by distracting attention away from those truly responsible. And Poirot was beginning to suspect that they all knew far more than they were letting on. His mind returned to the timeline of events. Ratchet had been stabbed 12 times, yet some of the wounds had been deep and forceful, while others had been weak and hesitant. It was as if more than one person had wielded the knife, each leaving their mark. It was an unusual pattern, one that did not match the typical profile of a single assailant. Poirot had seen many murders in his time, but this one did not feel like a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment act of revenge. It felt like a ritual, deliberate, calculated, and planned down to the last detail. The clues were beginning to fall into place, but Poirot was not yet ready to present his conclusions. He still needed to test his theory, to confirm that his suspicions were correct. He knew that the truth was within reach, hidden beneath the layers of deception that had been carefully constructed. And he knew that soon he would have to confront the passengers with what he had uncovered. Hercule Poirot sat in deep contemplation, his mind sifting through the increasingly tangled web of deception surrounding the murder of Samuel Ratchet, formerly known as Cassetti. The case was unlike any he had encountered before. So many individuals seemed to have both motive and opportunity. Every new interview peeled back another layer. Yet instead of revealing a single killer, the evidence suggested something far more complex. Poirot had a growing suspicion that this crime was not the work of a lone assassin, but rather a meticulously orchestrated act involving multiple conspirators. The question was how many, and how had they managed to commit the crime in a way that left no definitive proof of their involvement. As the snowbound train remained still on the tracks, Poirot decided it was time to test his theory. He requested a private conversation with Mary Debenham, the composed and intelligent English governess. Throughout the investigation, she had remained unnervingly calm, as though she were accustomed to keeping secrets. Poirot found that intriguing. From the moment he first saw her on the journey to Istanbul, she had given the impression of someone carrying a burden, someone who had resolved herself to a course of action long before events unfolded. He wanted to know what that burden was. Mary entered the dining car where Poirot had set up his informal interview space, her demeanor cool and controlled. She took her seat, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "You were acquainted with Colonel Armstrong, were you not?" Poirot asked directly. Mary hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Poirot caught it. "I knew of him," she said carefully. "His family was well known." Poirot tapped his fingers on the table. "Miss Debenham, you are a woman of intelligence and discipline. I do not believe for one moment that you are a casual bystander in all this." He leaned forward slightly. "When we spoke earlier, you were remarkably composed for someone caught in the middle of a murder investigation. Most innocent people display confusion, fear, even indignation at being suspected. Yet you are like a woman who has rehearsed her role well." Her expression did not falter, but there was a slight tightening of her jaw. "That is an interesting theory, Monsieur Poirot." "Let us not speak in theories, but in truths," he countered. "The death of Ratchet Cassetti was not an accident, nor an act of singular revenge. It was justice, was it not? And justice, when it cannot be served by the law, is sometimes taken into the hands of those who have suffered." Mary's lips pressed together, her carefully maintained poise finally showing the faintest signs of strain. Poirot knew he was close to the heart of the mystery. He decided not to push her further for now. Instead, he moved on to his next subject, someone he suspected might not be as practiced in the art of deception. Antonio Foscarelli, the exuberant Italian businessman, had presented himself as a mere automobile salesman. But Poirot found his behavior oddly excessive, as though he were overplaying his role. When Foscarelli took a seat before him, Poirot wasted no time. "You were the chauffeur for the Armstrong family, were you not?" Poirot asked. Foscarelli blinked in surprise, then let out a deep sigh. "So, you know, he muttered, shaking his head. Yes, I drove for them. I was with them when Daisy was born. That little girl, she was like my own niece. His voice thickened with emotion. When she was taken, when that monster stole her from us, I cannot describe the pain. It broke us all. Poirot studied Foscarely's reaction carefully. Unlike Mary, the Italian man wore his heart on his sleeve. He had no skill in deception. He had simply been following a script. And that, Poirot realized, was the key to understanding this case. He turned his attention to Princess Dragomirov next. The elderly Russian noblewoman had been one of the few to answer his questions with an air of untouchable authority. She had admitted to being a close friend of the Armstrong family, but claimed ignorance regarding the murder. Poirot, however, was unconvinced. He sat across from her, hands folded neatly. Your Highness, you have spoken much about your admiration for Mrs. Armstrong, and yet you would have me believe that you had no part in this act of justice. Princess Dragomirov gave him a slow, knowing smile. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice calm and measured, there are some things that are not spoken aloud, even in the presence of a detective. That was answer enough. She did not deny it. Poirot now had all the confirmation he needed. The passengers, many of them, if not all, were involved in this crime. It was a collective act, a secret held by multiple people, all bound together by a shared grief, a shared anger. He took a deep breath and returned to his compartment. The final piece of the puzzle had yet to be placed. He needed to reconstruct the night of the murder with absolute precision. If his suspicions were correct, Ratchet had not been murdered by one person, but by a group. Each of them had taken part. Each had struck a blow. Some with vengeance, some with hesitation, but all with purpose. This was no ordinary murder. It was an execution, a trial conducted outside the boundaries of the law. Now, Poirot had to decide, what would he do with this truth? Hercule Poirot sat in his compartment, staring at the snow-covered landscape outside. The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place, but the revelation of the crime's nature weighed heavily on his mind. This was not a case of one guilty person among many innocents. Instead, it was a crime committed by a collective, a dozen people bound by grief, loss, and a sense of justice that the legal system had failed to provide. Each passenger had played a role in the death of Samuel Ratchet, the man once known as Cassetti, the infamous child murderer. The detective had interviewed each suspect thoroughly, watching for inconsistencies, testing their composure, and drawing out emotional responses where possible. He now saw the truth clearly. Every one of them had been connected, in some way, to the Armstrong family tragedy. Some were family, others were loyal employees, and a few were dear friends. But all had lost something when Daisy Armstrong was taken and killed. Their pain had united them in an extraordinary act of vengeance. Poirot knew the details of the Armstrong case well. It had been one of the most sensational crimes of its time, a heart-wrenching story that had gripped the world. The Armstrongs had been a wealthy and well-respected family in America. Colonel Armstrong, a war hero, and his wife, Sonia, had built a life of privilege and happiness, only for it to be shattered when their daughter, Daisy, was kidnapped. A ransom was paid, but the child was murdered anyway. The horror of the event destroyed the Armstrongs. Sonia died in childbirth from the stress. Colonel Armstrong took his own life, and even their loyal maid, who had been wrongly accused of being involved, ended up dead. And the man responsible, Cassetti, escaped justice. Until now. Poirot rose from his chair, adjusting his mustache as he made his way back to the dining car, where the suspects sat, waiting for his final judgment. He could feel the tension in the air as he entered. Conversations stopped, eyes darted toward him, and some of the passengers straightened their postures, bracing themselves for what was to come. He glanced around the room. Mary Debenham and Colonel Arbuthnot sat side by side, exchanging quick glances as though reassuring each other. Princess Dragomirov sat regally in her seat, her face unreadable. The Count and Countess Androny remained poised, though the Count's hand rested protectively over his wife's. Mitchell, the conductor, stood nervously by the door, while Antonio Foscarelli, the boisterous Italian, looked unusually subdued. Poirot placed his hands on the table in front of him and spoke with quiet authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I have reached a conclusion." A ripple of tension passed through the group, though no one spoke. The murder of Samuel Ratchet was not the work of one person, Poirot continued. It was the work of 12. A few gasps filled the room, but most of the passengers remained still, their expressions frozen. "The evidence was clear from the start," Poirot went on, pacing slightly as he spoke. "The number of stab wounds, some deep and forceful, others weak and hesitant, suggested different hands at work. The inconsistencies in the alibis, the presence of a conductor's uniform that no one could account for, and most of all, the fact that each of you had a personal connection to the Armstrong case. It was too much to ignore." Dr. Constantine, who had been assisting Poirot with the medical examination, furrowed his brow. But how could 12 people commit a murder together? Poirot turned to him. "That is the true brilliance of this crime," he said. "Each person took part. One by one, each of them entered Ratchet's compartment and delivered a blow. Some did so with great hatred, others with reluctance, but all were involved." The room fell silent. "Tell me, Monsieur Bouc," Poirot said, turning to his old friend, who had been listening with increasing astonishment. "What is the duty of a detective? To uncover the truth, yes. But what does one do when the truth is unthinkable?" Bouc shifted in his seat, looking uneasy. "What do you mean?" Poirot let the question hang in the air before answering. "This was not an ordinary murder. It was an execution. The people before us are not criminals in the usual sense. They are people who have suffered and who believed that justice had failed them. And so, they took justice into their own hands." Mary Debenham finally spoke, her voice measured but with an underlying tension. "And what do you intend to do with this knowledge, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot studied her for a long moment before replying. "That is the question, is it not?" He turned back to the entire group. "There are two possible solutions to this case. The first is the official one, that an unknown intruder boarded the train, murdered Ratchet, and escaped into the night." A murmur passed through the room as the implications became clear. "And the second solution?" Colonel Arbuthnot asked, his voice steady but with a hint of challenge. Poirot gave a small smile. "The second solution is the truth, that all of you, bound by loyalty, love, and grief, came together to rid the world of a monster." Silence stretched across the room. Princess Dragomirov broke it. "You have great power in your hands, Monsieur Poirot," she said gravely. "You may save us, or you may condemn us." Poirot nodded. He was well aware of the weight of his decision. If he revealed the truth, justice would demand that all 12 conspirators be turned over to the authorities. But was it truly justice? Ratchet had been a murderer, a man who had caused untold suffering and had escaped legal punishment. Was it wrong that these people had acted when no one else would? Poirot looked at Bouc and Dr. Constantine. They, too, were waiting to see what he would do. And so, the great detective made his choice. Hercule Poirot stood before the assembled passengers, his revelation hanging heavy in the air. The weight of the truth had settled on everyone's shoulders, and for the first time, there were no more denials, no more feigned innocence. The dozen conspirators sat in tense silence, their fates now seemingly in Poirot's hands. Outside, the snow still held the train in place, nature itself forcing them all to remain together a little longer. Inside the dining car, the air felt thick with suspense. Poirot observed the people before him, 12 individuals bound together by loss, grief, and ultimately, revenge. The murder of Samuel Ratchet, once known as Cassetti, had not been the act of a single hand. It had been carried out by all of them. Poirot slowly walked around the table, letting his gaze linger on each suspect. There was Mary Debenham, her composure carefully maintained, yet her eyes betrayed the tension within. Colonel Arbuthnot, the honorable soldier, sat rigidly upright, his lips pressed into a firm line. Princess Dragomirov's aged face remained unreadable, her aristocratic demeanor unshaken by the detective's pronouncement. The Count and Countess Androny sat together, the Count's fingers tapping absently on the table, while his wife looked pale but composed. Mitchell, the train conductor, stood near the door, his hands clasped tightly. At last, it was Mrs. Hubbard who broke the silence. "So, what now, Mr. Poirot?" Her voice had lost its earlier air of dramatics. Now, there was only quiet resolve. Poirot folded his hands in front of him. "That is the question, madam. What now?" There were two possible solutions. Poirot had already laid them out. The first was the truth, that each of them had taken part in the killing of Ratchet, avenging the Armstrong family in a carefully orchestrated execution. The second was a fabrication, a story that an unknown intruder had somehow sneaked aboard the train, committed the murder, and vanished into the snowy night. Dr. Constantine, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "What do you believe, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot turned to his old friend, Monsieur Bouc, the director of the train company, who had been sitting in stunned silence. Bouc had followed every twist and turn of the case, but now, as the truth lay before him, he seemed deeply uneasy. "Mon cher Bouc," Poirot said, "you are a man of the law. What do you believe should be done?" Bouc's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at the faces around him. These were not common criminals. They were respectable people who had suffered deeply, and the man they had killed had been a monster. He swallowed hard and glanced at Poirot. "There is justice," Bouc said slowly, "and then there is the law. Sometimes they are not the same thing." Poirot gave a small, sad smile. "Just so." The detective looked around the room once more. His decision was clear, though it did not come easily. He saw no murderers before him, only people who had been left broken by an unspeakable crime. Cassetti had not merely killed Daisy Armstrong, he had destroyed an entire family, leaving devastation in his wake. The world had failed to bring him to justice. These 12 people had taken it upon themselves to do what no court had done. At last, Poirot took a deep breath. "Here is what will happen," he said. "Monsieur Bouc, you will inform the authorities that we have discovered the first solution, the fabricated one. We will say that an unknown murderer boarded the train, took his vengeance upon Ratchet, and then disappeared into the night." A wave of relief passed through the group. A few closed their eyes. Princess Dragomirov inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging Poirot's decision. "There will be no more discussion of the true events," Poirot continued. "You will all return to your seats and wait for the train to be freed from the snow. When we arrive at the next station, the case will be declared unsolvable, and we will go our separate ways." Colonel Arbuthnot exhaled sharply, nodding in understanding. "You're a good man, Poirot." Poirot shook his head. "No, Colonel, I am not. I am simply a man who believes that in this case, justice has already been served." Mrs. Hubbard let out a long breath and leaned back in her chair. "Thank you," she said softly. Poirot inclined his head but did not reply. He had made his choice, but he knew that it would weigh on him. He had spent his life upholding the law, uncovering the truth, and ensuring that criminals were punished. But this was something different. It was not about the law. It was about morality, about human suffering, and about the gray areas that justice sometimes failed to acknowledge. Dr. Constantine and Bouck stood with him as the passengers quietly left the dining car, one by one. Some offered nods of gratitude, others simply walked past, silent but relieved. Poirot watched them go, knowing that he had given them their freedom, knowing that the burden of the truth now rested on his own shoulders alone. Bouck sighed as he sat down heavily in a chair. "Do you think we did the right thing, Poirot?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the snow glisten under the moonlight. "I do not know," he admitted at last, "but I do know this justice is not always black and white." The train remained still, trapped in the snow. But inside, a great weight had been lifted, at least for those who had sought their own justice. For Hercule Poirot, however, the burden remained. The train remained trapped in the snow, but within the dining car, the tension that had gripped its passengers was finally easing. The truth had been unveiled, and Poirot had chosen to let it remain a secret. Now, the conspirators sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what had transpired. Some looked exhausted, as if they had been holding their breath for too long. Others, like Princess Dragomirov, maintained an air of quiet dignity, unmoved by the storm that had passed through the room. Poirot, however, could not escape the storm in his own mind. He had made a decision, but it did not sit easily with him. The law was clear. A man had been murdered, and his killers should face justice. And yet, justice itself had taken an unusual form on this train. Samuel Ratchet, Cassetti, had escaped legal punishment for his crimes, but he had not escaped the punishment delivered by those who had suffered most from his cruelty. As Poirot sat lost in thought, Dr. Constantine placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are troubled, my friend," Poirot sighed, looking at the doctor. "How could I not be? I have always believed in order, in truth, in the clarity of the law. But tonight, I have allowed myself to bend those principles." Dr. Constantine gave him a small, understanding smile. "Perhaps the world is not as simple as we wish it to be." Bouck, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke. "This was the right decision, Poirot. You know it in your heart. That man deserved to die." Poirot shook his head. "No man has the right to decide who deserves to live and who deserves to die." He paused, then continued. "But in this case, I could not find it within myself to condemn them." As he spoke, the train shuddered slightly. A new energy seemed to ripple through the cars, as if nature itself had sensed the shift in the passengers' fates. A commotion began in the corridors, as voices outside the train called out. The men sent earlier to clear the tracks had finally succeeded. The Orient Express would move again. The news spread quickly, and soon the passengers were gathering their things, preparing for their journey to resume. In the corridor, Poirot watched as Mary Debenham whispered something to Colonel Arbuthnot, the tension in her face softening for the first time. The Countess Androny took her husband's hand, relief evident in her eyes. Even Mrs. Hubbard, who had carried herself with such theatrical energy, looked weary but content, as if a great burden had finally been lifted. Poirot turned back toward the dining car one last time, his mind replaying the events of the past day. He thought of Daisy Armstrong, the child whose tragic fate had led to all of this. He imagined what she might have become had she lived, how her parents, her family, might have found happiness instead of grief. There was no true justice in what had happened, only a balance restored in a way that was outside the law's reach. The whistle of the train pierced the cold night air, signaling its readiness to move forward. Poirot took a deep breath and adjusted his tie. There was nothing more to be done. His role was finished. As the train lurched forward, the case of the Orient Express was closed. But in Poirot's mind, the memory of it would remain. A case unlike any other, one that had tested the very foundation of what he believed to be right and wrong. The train rolled steadily onward, nearing its destination, the journey coming to its inevitable end. Within the compartments, the passengers sat in contemplative silence, their shared ordeal behind them, yet still lingering in their minds. Hercule Poirot, too, remained deep in thought, his usually sharp and methodical mind wrestling with an unfamiliar weight, one that neither logic nor deduction could easily dismiss. The case of Ratchet's murder had been unlike any he had ever encountered. The solution was as intricate as it was tragic, woven together by grief, love, and a desperate need for justice that the legal system had failed to provide. The 12 passengers who had taken part in the crime were not merely murderers. They were broken souls bound by a shared loss, seeking to right a wrong the world had ignored. Seated in the dining car with Bouc and Dr. Constantine, Poirot watched the snowy landscape slip past the windows. He knew that in just a short while he would disembark, leaving the case behind. But could he truly leave it behind? Bouc, sensing Poirot's unease, leaned forward. "It is over, my friend. You have done your part." Poirot sighed, shaking his head. "It is over, yes. But I am left with a question I cannot easily answer." Dr. Constantine furrowed his brow. "What question?" Poirot tapped his fingers on the table. "Justice. What is it truly? Is it the law? Or is it something greater, something that exists beyond rules and punishments?" He exhaled deeply. "I have spent my life believing that justice and law are one and the same, but this case, it has proven otherwise." Bouc nodded slowly. "You chose to let them go. That must mean something." Poirot remained silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice softer. "They were not innocent. And yet, neither were they guilty in the way that law defines guilt. They did what they believed was right, not out of malice, but out of love, out of loyalty to a child who had suffered a cruel fate." He paused. "Had I exposed them, they would have been punished. But would that punishment have been justice? Would it have undone the suffering of the Armstrong family? Would it have made the world a fairer place?" Dr. Constantine adjusted his glasses. "No, it would not have. But you made a choice, Poirot. You let them go. That that is an answer in itself. Poirot smiled faintly. Perhaps. Across the car, the passengers had begun to stir as the train neared its stop. Mary Debenham and Colonel Arbuthnot exchanged a quiet glance, understanding passing between them. The Count and Countess Androny sat close together, relief visible in their postures. Mrs. Hubbard, or rather Linda Arden, had retreated into herself, the weight of her role in the crime pressing upon her. As the train finally came to a halt, the passengers rose, gathering their belongings. The great snowstorm that had once trapped them was now behind them, the tracks cleared, the journey resumed. Poirot stood as well, straightening his coat. He knew that when he stepped off the train, the world would continue as if nothing had happened. The murder of Samuel Ratchet would remain an unsolved mystery in the eyes of the law, another death in the shadows of the world's justice system. And yet, Poirot understood that justice had been served, just not in the way he had always believed it should be. As he stepped onto the platform, a cold breeze brushing against his face, Poirot took one last look at the train. The Orient Express, a vessel of luxury and secrecy, had carried more than just passengers on this journey. It had carried a story of loss, revenge, and a unique form of justice that could only exist in the gray spaces between right and wrong. With a final nod to Bouc, Poirot walked away, his mind already moving toward the next case, the next mystery. But this one, he knew, would stay with him forever. Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express remains one of the most celebrated detective novels of all time. First published in 1934, it has captivated readers for generations, offering not just a thrilling mystery, but a profound exploration of morality, justice, and the human capacity for revenge. Unlike many traditional whodunits, the novel presents a solution that challenges the reader's expectations, asking them to consider whether justice can exist outside the bounds of the law. Hercule Poirot, Christie's iconic detective, is faced with one of the most complex ethical dilemmas of his career. His usual precision and reliance on logic are tested as he is forced to make a decision that is not about uncovering the truth, but about deciding what to do with that truth. The resolution, allowing the perpetrators to go free, stands as one of the most unique and memorable conclusions in detective fiction. The novel has been adapted numerous times for film, television, and stage, each adaptation bringing new life to the timeless mystery. Its themes of justice, morality, and human emotion continue to resonate, proving that Murder on the Orient Express is more than just a detective story. It is a philosophical exploration of crime and consequence,